Well, good afternoon to everyone. And I hope you've all had lunch and that you're not too hungry or too tired. And I'm also hoping this will be more of a fun presentation, or at least a little bit more kind of thinking creatively rather than technicalities. Because my ambition here is to challenge you with a different way of thinking rather than trends themselves, the travel trends themselves. The title is eTravel meets Strategic Foresight. In the last 20 years, I've worked in corporate strategy in the States and in the UK. Over the past 15 years, I've worked in strategic foresight, which is more of the scenario planning, thinking type of activity for corporates. And in the last 5 years, I've become so fascinated with change itself that not just observing outside change in the external world, but also internally organizational change and transformation. And I'm seeing a big link between these things. Actually, they can never be divided, right? They can never be kept separate. This presentation reflects a little bit of that. Oops. So let's talk a little bit about those three areas. The trend watching area is actually the scanning the external environment for early signals of change, and then monitoring how that change progresses into the future. My concern over the past few years has been, when I come to conferences like this, is that many people talk about the trends, the relevant trends for the industry, and most of the time they extrapolate them into the future as though the current conditions of change will remain the same. And what actually happens is that the conditions of change, and then a different future emerges, which seems to surprise everyone. It's unexpected. And I'm not claiming that we can predict those changes in the conditions of change, but there are ways to think about possibilities, which takes us to the scenario thinking part, which is the art of the possible. Different techniques, different methods for imagining and reframing the baseline future, which is the most likely future, but actually, as a colleague has said, the most likely future isn't, and it never happens. But we think that way, we work that way, and we imagine that the most likely will be, and then you go into all sorts of things like probabilities, which, can serve a purpose, but they're not always the best way. There are much more quantitative ways to figure out what may be happening and exploring alternative scenarios or alternative futures. And then organizational change is about adaptation, perhaps, or maybe even better still, transformation and being proactive about shaping the future and influencing it. As the saying goes, the best way to predict the future is to create it. And it sounds a little hardcore, but influencing and shaping is a possibility. Maybe, top-down approaches no longer work that well in a chaotic and complex world, but our presence in the world does make a difference in how we interact with it. It can influence. So this is the framework, and then the trend watching part. These are some of the trends in eTravel that I won't be talking about explicitly, but we will look at them in the context of the four scenarios that you'll see. So some of those are the sharing economy, gamification, wearables, augmented reality, of course, virtual reality as well, cognizant computing. All of those will play a role in the futures that we see, because they're not going away, but how they will unfold may be very different in different possible worlds. So another kind of cliche is a trend is a trend is a trend till it bends. And trends do bend. And oftentimes we are surprised when they do, because especially with more robust trends. And of course, there is a difference. When you look at demographics, for instance, demographic change happens fairly slowly. As we see climate change, we always expected it to happen slowly, but it doesn't always, it doesn't. Sometimes it surprises us in unique ways. Technology, of course, is a very rapid environment. So scenario thinking I've added a reference at the bottom here, just one article that talks about at least 23 ways of doing scenario work. This is the classic. This is called the 2x2 matrix. It's the Royal Dutch Shell way of thinking about the future since the 70s. When Royal Dutch Shell invented this method, and many of the books on scenarios are written by people in the strategy department of Shell, when they invented this method, actually they were the only oil company. They were number 9, I think, at the time, or maybe even number 13 from all their competitors. When they started thinking this way, it became the 3rd largest company in the world just because they had a scenario about falling oil prices. No one else in the industry had that scenario in place, and so the reaction time of everyone else was 6 months slower than Shell. So what we're seeing here, I've chosen, so this method works with 2 critical uncertainties. And I've chosen critical uncertainties that seem to be playing out at the moment. And if you take a longer time horizon, like 10 years, they are really critical uncertainties. You don't know, we don't know, we can't say what will happen 10 years from now along those 2 axes. One of the axes that I've taken is open societies and closed societies. We've always assumed in the past maybe 20 years that globalization will continue, and it probably will. But we're seeing signs of something else happening lately. Just the other day, a couple of days ago, the European Parliament voted, of course it has to be ratified if it happens at all, voted to enforce visas for US citizens. Now that's a pretty categorical sign of change happening in terms of closing borders, or at least taking some action to isolate each other, and a lot of other things that are happening. I mean, I don't need to mention Donald Trump, Brexit. We had Ambassador, His Excellency, the former ambassador of the US to Germany yesterday in the keynote speech talking about many of these issues as well. So that's one critical uncertainty along the vertical axis of closed societies and open societies. Which way will it go? It's like, right now it sounds like a 50-50 option. And the other one is around prosperity and scarcity. And again, we're seeing the signs. I mean, on the side of scarcity, we're talking about all the time about resource depletion, extreme weather, water crisis, failed climate change mitigation, political unrest. We're seeing it in the newspapers and the headlines: refugee crisis, migration, economic polarization, safety net failures, social security crisis, and terrorist threats. On the other side, we also have arguments around prosperity, or at least hopes that prosperity may come into the future. Rising middle classes across the world, Asia especially, technological breakthroughs, new materials that are making things cheaper, lighter, more robust, more sturdy, alternative fuels, successful climate change mitigation as a possibility in the future, medical breakthroughs, longevity, people's lives increasing all the time, hopefully youth employment and skills. Right now that's an if, right? We don't see much of that, but it may happen. Changing job descriptions, the future of work, new jobs coming up, maybe the old ones will be gone, but a lot of new jobs are at least imagined right now and possible. Perhaps a culture of innovation and initiative and empowerment will also foster this kind of future. On the open societies and closed societies, I didn't go into the details, but they're understandable. Closed societies are inward-looking, more insular. Protectionism is usually a keyword, a buzzword in that kind of life, while multiculturalism, the neoliberal values, Western values have for a long time been around the idea of open societies, free trade, and so on and so forth. So let's see what happens when we put this into context. Developing the 4 scenarios in the matrix, the first one, open society and prosperity, we've called it sharing the love. The second scenario with open societies and scarcity is kind of we're all in the same boat together. The closed societies in scarcity, it sounds like a very pessimistic scenario, but that's the poor and proud. And by the way, if you think about it, we've seen examples of all of this in the past, maybe in different times, maybe in different places, but all of these have played out somewhere in the world. And then prosperity in closed societies is kind of the gilded cage idea and scenario of we're fine here, but we don't care about what happens elsewhere. And this is another method. Now, don't look at the words. I've only put in the text so that it can be a prompt for you. It can help you out if you want to go into these kind of analysis. Again, the reference underneath, this is a colleague, Suhail Inayatullah, who invented this method. It's like digging deeper into any kind of analysis, but especially about scenarios and possible other scenarios about the future. He describes the 4 levels. There are 4 levels, and basically it looks like an iceberg with the tip of the iceberg he calls the litany phase, the litany level, which is usually what we see, what we can observe. That's the headline news. Those are the events that happen on an everyday basis. They're hardly ever disputed, very rarely questioned, or very rarely are the assumptions underneath questioned. And usually, unfortunately, a lot of trend work and a lot of foresight work is done on that level only. Not much lately, especially, but just looking at the manifestations of certain phenomena doesn't quite give you a better understanding of what may happen later on. On the level of systems, that's where most of the analytical work is done in a lot of the academic world work. On the level of systems, it looks as the systems dynamics of why those manifestations or why that litany in headlines is happening, the observable facts, events happening in the world. Systems dynamics, there we often talk about the 5 categories or sometimes more. The steep categories, those are the social, technological, economic, environmental, and political changes. So basically, as futurists, we tend to go broader, farther, and deeper into our analysis. So steep gives us the context for a specific issue. It could be eTravel, it could be tourism, but it could be something else. Now, it doesn't matter what the topic is, but we frame it in a way that looks at peripheral, important events in all the categories of social, technological, environmental, political. On the level of worldviews, that takes us even deeper into critical thinking and sometimes the discourse, and looking at the discourses. So you go into cultural analysis, contextual analysis, linguistic analysis. How do we talk about an issue? Why do we frame it in those words, that vocabulary? It could be about the actors. How are the actors interacting with the issue and their roles official? For instance, you might take a child's perspective on a certain issue in the future. What might a teenager think about? What might a school child think about? What might a policeman or a politician or entrepreneur within a certain future, how might they think? Those are the worldviews. And finally, on the level of myth and metaphor, an often neglected area, but those deep cultural myths and archetypes that we all share, probably culture-centric, as a Confucian culture would have different myths and different mind frames, worldviews than a Western progress-centric culture, and many others. So this is just an illustration. And I've taken this approach to look at our 4 scenarios. So on the level of on sharing the love, our first scenario, which, let's remind ourselves, is prosperity and open systems. On the litany level, these are all made up. So this supposedly is like, let's say, a time frame of 10 years from now. We might see headlines like wellness tourism is targeting virtual reality addicts or virtual reality caholics. But diseases of affluence, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart attacks, may be gone because maybe some kind of technological breakthroughs will have solved some of those problems, but new ones will appear. On the level of systems of steep, In this particular future, we might see a multicultural, multifaceted society. Identities are fluid. Basically, again, individualism perhaps stronger than in some of the others. Technology in service of progress. Again, very much a Western scenario in good times. A thriving economy, the environment is stretched, but it's not that much in focus. It's coping somehow. Resources and politics are the politics of democracy, global governance, either the same or revised, intact. Somehow the world is operating. On the worldview and discourses level, neoliberal discourse is obscuring current day have-nots. So it's a world of haves and have-nots as well. But the have-nots don't have a voice because they're kind of stifled by the optimism of this scenario. And the metaphor that we've come up with here, and of course all of these are, as you can assume, there's certain assumptions underneath, and you can go much deeper and with a lot more detail into them. But everyone's a winner as a deep cultural metaphor. So progress is always looking up. It's always this arrow of change happening for the better all the time. In this kind of scenario, if you think about cyclicality, for instance, it's a disappointment. We don't like cycles when we are progress-minded or any other reversals. And eTravel, the trends that we saw earlier, are all more or less put in service of progress. Bigger, better, faster. Maybe smaller in some miniaturization. Could also be not necessarily bigger, but so the sharing economy goes upscale. Excuse me. Smart everything. Augmented tourism is the new normal. Virtual reality as maybe teasers to an otherwise bustling tourist industry, international, and so on. We're all in this together is our second scenario with open systems and scarcity. This started to feel a little bit like the green scenario. Excuse me, just take some water. So it's an international global world, but it's under some form of austerity, with a deep concern about the ecology. Society is in motion, it travels, and it's green, or aims to be. Technologies in service of sustainability and resilience. The economy may go into the direction of minimal social income, purposeful organizations, some form of even spirituality perhaps becoming more mainstream. Different forms of spirituality probably, and a deep concern about corporate social responsibility and advancing into sustainability priorities. The environment may be hurting at that time, but it will be cared for and it will be a priority. The worldviews here are in the dominant discourses of care, responsibility, and sustainability, but the shadow discourses underneath all that may be of cynicism and a perception of exploitation of people and the environment. The metaphor is animate earth, and eTravel is in service of this sustainability and resilience. The sharing economy probably expands in this context, and augmented ecotourism and gamification become the edutainment of the times. I forgot to mention kind of a quirky headline in a possible future paper that Google launches GreenJet, the long-haul budget airline that runs on solar energy, serving wildlife-preserving honeymooners to the Arctic. It's just to illustrate the kind of concerns and priorities that people may have in this scenario. We're all in this together. Closed systems and scarcity. The litany or a possible example might be Parliament passes a bill on mandatory aeroponics. Plan your next vacation on your balcony. Aeroponics, as you know, is vertical agriculture, and urban vertical agriculture. Just because people need to eat, right? So they need to grow something somewhere. On the steep level of the category, society is codependent on political leadership, often in a state of learned helplessness. That idea that although they may be capable and competent, they may be so disenchanted and disenfranchised that initiative is not taking place. And active, but there could be a strong subversive different movements that may counter this complacency. Technology in service of survival and security. So a lot of eTravel and technology may go in the direction of security as a main concern. At the same time, travel is not international anymore, so it will be more about border protection, domestic tourism, environment under severe and growing pressure, and politics of fear, paternalism, totalitarian are all possible here. The dominant discourse of fear and scarcity, the shadow discourses of liberation, hope, and power dynamics may be, again, not voiced officially, but could be strong underground movements. The metaphor could be something like the Stockholm Syndrome, at least the official metaphor, kind of the capture bonding between hostages and government in this case. eTravel in this particular example, in a way, even substitutes physical travel. Tourism is domestic, and it could be virtual reality. So I have an example just after this slide to tell you how I was thinking about this. Of course, all of these are exaggerated scenarios, and they should be so, because the idea is to stretch our thinking, and by stretching, exaggerating them, we might come up with ideas that normally we wouldn't think of. For instance, wearable technology might go into, you may have a vest which is a jamming device, because, again, based on yesterday's news on CNN, the WikiLeaks, I don't know if you heard it, but the fact that some protocols, algorithms, I think, have leaked into cyberspace about the CIA and how they are surveilling and how they can even, it's not new news, but it's just become a headline news, that how your phone and your computer may be observing you. Tourism, in this particular scenario, contracts with government and companies for something like hostel holidays for local population, and maybe a very small segment of uber luxury, smart tourism serving political elites. Just possibilities. And the example that I wanted to give you is from a resort that I work with right now in Bulgaria, Helena Resort. As an example, thinking about in this scenario, what might we do, especially when you think that perhaps, we have 2 hotels, and maybe one will be contracted with as a kind of perhaps, or both may work with government and companies, but we, thinking that maybe the ambition is still to be able to open up virtually, at least, to an outside external market, international. What might we offer that can be digitized? And the Black Sea has some wonderful places, but it's not, I find it hard to imagine that some sort of experiential digital kind of application or something like that might be so tantalizing that people would buy it. But what I realize is that we have 5,000 pieces of original artwork in the company, and because we're, the people who work there all the time, I'm not there all the time, but we take it for granted because it's there, but we don't even think about it as an art hotel, but the artifacts are there. So maybe a product, could be made which It's more educational, edutainment around the cultural artifacts, but that's probably too much of a stretch. However, an augmented reality app is a good idea that we wouldn't have come up with if we hadn't gone through the scenarios. Because as I say, it's taken for granted for us. And finally, the Gilded Cage scenario is the closed systems, but within an economy, a prosperous economy. So here the litany might be America first, China first, Russia first, who wants to be second? Everyone is isolated, but their ambitions are to be first. Society is kind of smug, technology in service of comfort, economy thriving and local, environment is doing okay under those conditions perhaps, but the politics are of power, strength, isolationism, and nationalism. The official discourse of dominance, but there may be alternative discourses which are fractured and silenced of other-minded people. Here, otherness and alterity are words that come up often, and otherness is not accepted, it's not much liked. The metaphor is taking care of our own. It sounds a little Sicilian. eTravel is in service of comfort. Tourism is domestic and high-end. Here again, maybe tourism contracts with governments and companies for local populations, but everyone is an elite in these circumstances. And perhaps a small segment of luxury tourism for incognito celebrities and elites that are allowed to cross countries and borders, but they're usually under secrecy and high security for their own protection. The future will not be any of these scenarios, but it will contain perhaps elements of some of them. And the bad news is that no one can tell you which elements or what combinations. But thinking through them gives your company perhaps some sort of, it's like being in a airplane simulator, a flight simulator. It prepares you to think through some of those possibilities and prepare responses. And then if, as Royal Dutch Shell has done, if the circumstances do come up, at least you're a little bit ahead of the game and perhaps even proactively could respond. Some of those, you might find responses that are beneficial in all four scenarios, and those are really the win-wins. But it's a way of challenging your perceptions, your minds. And finally, in terms of organizational transformation, and I haven't been looking at the slides, but I'm pretty sure that I have to finish up very quickly. This is not change management. Change management is top-down approaches to change. This is more about human-centric collective intelligence processes where you can get the whole system in the room or the whole company in the room, involve everyone, engage your human capital. And with approaches like World Cafe, many of you I'm sure know about or can look up, and approaches like Appreciative Inquiry, you can come up with your preferred scenario of the future. It doesn't mean that you can achieve everything in the preferred scenario, but again, yesterday there were at least 3 presentations talking about values, and I was very happy to hear that, because often in technical conferences, values don't often come up. So you can do a causal layered analysis on your preferred future. There are ways to do that. You can start with the metaphor or start with the litany and then fill in the middle. And I thank you very much for your attention. I hope this can be useful in some way to you and that you might be kind of interested to apply some of those ideas and notions. Thanks a lot.